These are from the book Tales of Bethlehem, stories by Boyd Peterson. That's me. This one is called Jeremiah, a Shepherd's Tale. As I stood watching the scene before me, I reflected on so many unusual and wonderful events that had led up to this miraculous night. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Jeremiah. I am a descendant of the prophet of the same name. I am a seventh generation shepherd, so it is in my blood to do the tending of the sheep that are used in the temple in Jerusalem. I am my father's third son and the one chosen to be the shepherd of the temple flocks. Just 2 years ago, I also became a spiritual teacher for our people. Shepherds don't usually go to the same schools and synagogues that Jewish scholars and children do. Instead, a leader is chosen to learn the writings of the prophets and to teach them to the other shepherds and their families. I was chosen when I was but a youth to learn at the feet of a temple worker named Zacharias. I was taught at his hand how to read and write. He then tutored me in the scriptures and how to teach our people. He became a second father to me, although my father also taught me all that he knew. I had spent many years learning from Zacharias when I wasn't tending sheep in the hills south of Jerusalem or north of Bethlehem. The process of learning to be the shepherd teacher takes many years. It is only when you reach your 30th year that you are allowed to assume that responsibility. My father fulfilled that sacred duty himself until I came of age. He was becoming old and was ready to pass the mantle to another. When the time came, he spent many hours with me, preparing me to take over the sacred calling. It was also the role of this leader to come to the temple each week to meet with the temple workers and to bring sheep for food and for sacrifices. As such, our family would go often to spend time in Jerusalem, unlike the other shepherds who would only make that trek each year as we brought the sheep back to the winter stables. Zacharias had been called to work in the temple when he was in his 20th year and loved to serve there. He and his wife, Sariah, had been married for several years when he was called to the work. It had been many years, and they had not had children of their own. Zacharias honorably served in the temple. He especially loved to work with those of us who were not as well respected in the community. For many generations, being a shepherd of the temple flocks was considered one of the most high callings. Today, the people have turned away from this belief, and we are considered less desirable, not welcome. But not to Zacharias, not to his wife. They invited my family over to their humble home to break bread often. We became family to them, and we were nourished by their love. The unusual time of which I write began about a year ago when Zacharias was chosen to light the temple fire. I was there the day at the temple, along with my father and Sariah. To light the fire in the inner court at the Holy of Holies was a great honor, and Zacharias had never been chosen to do so in all the years he had worked at the temple. Most temple workers got to light the fire only once in their lifetime. Some were never chosen. Zacharias had served in the temple for more than 25 years, and finally the lot fell to him. I remember the excitement in his face and how nervous he was as he bid us goodbye as he went to prepare to enter the temple. Yet, as he walked away, he was confident and ready for this honor. Zacharias was in the inner part of the temple for a long time, longer than others had spent in the past. Finally, at long last, we saw him coming out of the temple, but we noticed he walked more slowly than when he went in. He was also physically changed. His hair had more gray than before, and he seemed to have a glow about him. I could see something unexpected had happened during this time in the inner court. He glanced in our direction and motioned for us to come to him. Another temple worker joined us, asking Zacharias if there had been some problem. It had been so long. Zacharias opened his mouth, but nothing came out. We could see he was mouthing words, but not a sound could be heard. He indicated that he needed to write something down. When a writing instrument and parchment were brought forward, he wrote, "I doubted the Lord, and a message an angel had delivered to me. He has struck me dumb until it comes to pass." By this time, several temple workers had gathered around asking questions. They seemed fearful, and some expressed doubt about Zacharias' account. The head ordinance worker came forward and asked Zacharias what message had he received from the Lord. He wrote that it was a private message and that he was instructed not to share it with anyone. The temple worker immediately took offense to this, and while indicating that he held a position of authority, demanded to know the contents of the message. Zacharias simply wrote, "I am to have a son." The ordinance worker then stepped back, looked at him. After a few moments, he exclaimed, "You must have fallen asleep and dreamed this message. Why would you be chosen to get any kind of a message?" He then turned to look at Sariah and said, "You are too old. You are barren, and that is all there is to this." He then walked back into the temple, leaving Sariah to cry in the arms of Zacharias. I wanted to teach this ordinance worker a lesson about compassion, but my father placed his hand on my shoulder, and I knew that it wasn't worth it. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse. Zacharias truly couldn't speak, but he stood tall now, and he still had the glow about him. He turned away and signaled for us to follow him. It wasn't until later that he confided in the three of us that it was an angel named Gabriel that had brought him the news of his son. He also told Zacharias about the Messiah, that he would be born soon, and that Zacharias' son would be the prophet to announce the coming of the Lord. He was to tell only his family about this news. He wrote that there were other things that he was told not to discuss until they came to pass. As we left that day, both my father and I felt a special spirit which brought excitement and a warm feeling to our souls about the truth of this message. We knew that Zacharias had not been dreaming. It was several weeks before we saw Zacharias and Sariah again. Our friend had been relieved of his temple duties until his voice returned. On one occasion, they had sent for us to come to their home with our family. There was a celebration feast waiting for us when we arrived. Sariah made the announcement that she was indeed pregnant, and they were expecting their child in just over 6 months. It was a great time of great joy. They were so happy about the news and the great honor that they had been given. We often went to see them over the next few months until the winter came. During the winter, we stayed on the south side of the mountains near Jerusalem. Stables had been cut into the side of the mountain to protect the herds from the storms that would frequently chill the air and make this a most difficult of jobs. Just after the winter solstice, Sariah gave birth to a son. They named him John, as the angel had told Zacharias to do. That day, his voice was restored, and he went to the temple to pray and give thanks for the miracle in their lives. We visited a few days later when they were naming the child at the synagogue. We were also there for the sacrifice at the temple. Zacharias repeatedly gave thanks to God and reminded people that this was a miracle beyond the power of man. Each year, when it was time for the birth of the new lambs, we moved the flocks to the hills just north of Bethlehem, which have more vegetation and fewer rocks. There it is easier to spot predators before they reach the young sheep and the sheep that are about to give birth. This migration happens just after the fourth cycle of the moon after the winter solstice. It is a big event for the families and the herds. At this time, it is still spring and the weather can be unpredictable, but during the time of which I write, the weather was mild. The nights are generally still cold, but the days are warm and it is great to be in the open fields. At the time of which I write, we had settled the sheep in the summer grazing areas. During the day, we each had areas that we would lead our sheep to graze and water. We had a certain place for each family to graze their sheep, but everyone used the watering hole, and we took turns taking our herds there. If too many sheep came to the hole at once, they would sometimes take fright and would tramp through the water, leaving it muddied for several days. During the night, the shepherds would gather all the flocks together for safety. We had set up a rotation of several shepherds that would watch the flocks by night. Each family provided a watch person. Generally, the watchmen were 8 years or older and included 4 fathers. 2 camp areas were set up above the flocks on the hills, with 3 to 4 people per camp. The herd stayed in the valley in the grass that they would graze on during the day. While it wasn't long, the grass was plentiful and made a great carpet for them to sleep on. The sheep seldom got up to graze during the night, which meant that they were very still and easy to watch. Each night at dusk, it is our custom for 2 groups of shepherds to gather together near the crest of the hill to count the herds. This allows us to make sure that the sheep are all accounted for and that there aren't any robbers or predators lying in wait for the night to fall. One of our people is stationed near our camp to relay any warnings if something happens during the night. This is how it was done for hundreds of years since the days of Solomon. It was on just such a night that I was with the night shepherds, watching for robbers and predators. We stopped to talk for a few minutes as the last rays of the setting sun lit the western horizon. It was a beautiful, almost cloudless night. The stars were beginning to appear. In just a short time, we could see so many stars that it almost seemed to be day. As we were just beginning to move to our separate camps, we noticed a star that was far brighter than all the others in the sky. And it kept getting brighter and seemed to be getting closer and closer. It appeared to be coming right at us. We began to fear what this might be. I shielded my eyes as it got close and dropped to the ground to protect my eyes from the intense light. I glanced around and all the other shepherds were doing the same. I decided to look up at the light that was now stronger than the noonday sun. Its intense light was all around us. As I glanced up, shielding my eyes, I saw a person inside the light, descending from above us. Soon my eyes became accustomed to the brightness, and I felt a warm glow which reminded me of the Holy Spirit that Zacharias had with him the day he saw the angel of God in the temple. I knew this Spirit, the witness of God and of good. I immediately moved to a kneeling position rather than the crouched position I was in. I bowed my head and praised God. The other shepherds followed my example. I stole a look only to see that the person was now standing directly in front of me, about 5 feet above the ground, dressed in white with a glow of such splendor that it defied description. It was a man, a little younger than me, with dark brown beard, round face, and a broad smile on his face. His kind brown eyes assured me that everything was going to be all right. He looked directly at me and he spoke, "Jeremiah, arise." He then addressed each of the other shepherds by name and told them to rise. He knew each of us, from the youngest to the oldest, by name. I stood but kept my head bowed in reverence for this person. He then turned to me again and said, "I am Gabriel." I looked up at him to look into his eyes. I am a messenger from God, our Father. I am the same who visited Zacharias in the temple and foretold of his son. Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. Suddenly the light grew brighter around him, and we heard voices praising God in song. We could see hosts of angels singing behind Gabriel. There must have been hundreds, if not thousands, of heavenly hosts singing, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." Gabriel continued, "And this shall be a sign unto you. Ye shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. His mother is Mary, the cousin of Zacharias, whom you have met, Jeremiah. Wake the other shepherds and go give praise, for you have been chosen among all people because of your righteousness to witness this most holy of events. Bear witness of it to all who ask, and teach your children about this glorious event." The heavenly host sang louder and stronger. After some time, Gabriel started ascending slowly heavenward, followed by the beautiful chorus. We could do nothing but watch as they left. We stood there for a long time in silence. I finally said we should wake the others if they hadn't already been stirred from the sleep by the heavenly singing. We stood near the crest of the hill that separated our sleeping sheep from Bethlehem. I turned and walked the short distance to the top of the hill and gazed upon the city. It lay sleeping, but a low-hanging star now shone directly over the city, in particular the section of the city where the caves and stable lay. I turned to see the messenger that I had sent to the encampment had returned, but only a few shepherds had joined him. It was mainly the fathers of the households who had joined us, and one especially young shepherd, my son David. He was the youngest of the group, but had not yet reached the age of 8, so he could not serve as a night watch. David had already been appointed to follow in my footsteps to become the leader of the shepherds when the time came. The person stationed next to the camp hadn't seen or heard anything other than a light near our group. He thought someone had lit a torch with a bright burning oil. He did see the light ascend and disappear into the stars and thought it was odd. My wife Ruth and several of the brethren's wives had joined us now and listened as I told them what had happened. The story seemed astonishing to everyone, but some accepted it immediately. The spirit that we had felt and shared was strong, but even so, some doubted that there was a messenger at all. I assigned 2 of the teenage shepherds to stay and watch the flocks as the rest of us went to Bethlehem. It was only a short journey from the crest of the hill. The stars were bright, but all marveled at the new star that none of us had seen before. It gave great light to our trek, and we easily negotiated our way down the hill to Bethlehem. About an hour after we started our journey, we came to the area where the inns and the stables were all set against the southern hill of the city. We quietly went from stable to stable looking for the sign that Gabriel had given us. There were many alleys and side streets to check. Many people were still on the street, having just arrived because of the taxation that was to take place the next day in the city. There was no room for all these people to find lodging. At last, I came upon a small stable behind a humble inn, which had a light aglow. It was about 20 feet long and almost that deep, hand cut into the side of the hill. It housed the animals of the travelers that stayed at the inn. As I glanced over the rails of the stable, I could see some camels, horses, and donkeys sleeping. There was a place for water to my immediate left, and a small section that housed several goats, all in a rather cramped space. In the middle of the stable, I saw Mary, the child's mother, just as Gabriel had said, with Joseph the carpenter, her husband, beside her. Mary was seated facing something in front of Joseph. There was another person sitting behind Mary. I opened the gate, and as they turned, Joseph stepped aside, and I could see a beautiful baby lying in a manger. The baby was asleep on a blanket. He had dark brown hair and was wrapped in swaddling clothes. I took 2 steps into the stable and immediately dropped to my knees before our Redeemer. My eyes filled with tears, and the Spirit bore witness that this was the Son of God, the Christ whose coming had been foretold for generations. Mary was surprised but happy to see us. We could see she was tired, but this young mother was still willing to share her newborn with us. She was about a head shorter than I was, and Joseph a half a head taller. While Mary was small in stature, Joseph was broad. He was also strong and somewhat a bit older than Mary, but you could see that they loved each other. Mary picked up the baby and handed him to Ruth, who had come and sat beside her. He slept quietly as Mary and Ruth held him. Mary shyly embraced me and David. I told them the story of Gabriel and the heavenly hosts. They did not seem surprised by what had been taking place. Mary asked if I would send word the next day to Zacharias and Sariah that Mary's son, Jesus, had been born that night. She said that they would be excited to know about the birth of Jesus. My brethren and their families who had come with us knelt before the babe too. We took turns coming into the small stable to behold the beautiful sight. We did not want to leave, but we could see that the couple was extremely tired, so we embraced them and bid them farewell. I closed the gate to the stable and looked again upon Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. As I stood watching the scene before me, I reflected on the many unusual and wonderful events that had led me to this miraculous night. I testified that Jesus has come. I have seen an angel, I have heard a heavenly chorus, and I know Jesus is this Christ.